Okay, so this is the third installment, the third episode of our Cold War Hotspots series. And we're going to be talking about the Cold War in Asia. And particularly, we're going to be talking about two places, Korea and Vietnam. The Cold War also is deeply important in China as well. That's going to be its own set of lessons. So we're not going to be talking about that today. Instead, we're going to be talking about two, well, mostly one, um, but also two what we call proxy wars. So, a proxy is a stand in. So, because of what I talked about in the last episode, which was mutually assured destruction, because of MAD, the United States and the Soviet Union can never actually fight, right? It's like a big no no. They cannot actually fight because if they do, there's less stopping them from kind of all out nuclear warfare. So instead, they fight with stand ins, right? With people who aren't them. So, for example, the United States fights against the North Vietnamese communists. The North Vietnamese communists are supported by the Chinese and the Soviets, but we are not actually fighting them. In Afghanistan, the Soviet Union will invade. They will fight against a rebel group known as the Mujahideen. The United States is supporting and giving arms to the Mujahideen, but we are not fighting the Soviet Union, right? So that's how these are proxy wars. The United States and the Soviet Union cannot actually come to blows, so to speak, because then it's a hot war, not a cold war, right? So instead, there are these proxy wars. So the Cold War in Asia, where we're going to be focusing here and here. So we're going to start with Korea. Not only because it's the first chronologically, but also because it kind of comes on the heels of World War One. So, or I'm sorry, World War Two. So, we occupy Japan after the end of World War Two, and we also occupy South Korea. The Soviet Union gets to occupy North Korea. Okay. The Korean War is fought from 1950 to 1953. It ends with a ceasefire. It's still not technically over. It's often called the Korean War, right? When we talk about the Cold War in Asia, everyone talks about Nam. Everyone talks about the Vietnam War. But a lot of people seem to forget about the Korean War. So let's start in 1949. So in 1949, China falls to the communists. And also during that year, a civil war between the two Koreas breaks out. So remember, this one, actually, we'll go. This one is occupied by the Soviet Union. This one occupied by the United States. This one sets up a communist government. I'm sorry. This one sets up a communist government, right? The Soviet Union sets up a communist government in its half. The United States sets up a democracy in its half. It's kind of a quote unquote democracy. It's led by a guy named, his last name is Ray. Syngman is his first name. He's not great, but it's not communist, right? We kind of know where the United States falls on that during this time period. So in 1949, after the fall of China to the communists, that's when the Civil War breaks out between North Korea and South Korea. And then it becomes a full-fledged war. And the United States, President Truman, goes to the UN, to the United Nations, to seek authorization for the defense, right, to stop the Civil War in the Koreas. He does this in June of 1950. The United States never declares war in Korea. Instead, we call it a police action. That way, it can also be deeply contained to the executive branch of the government. The Congress doesn't have to approve police actions, so that's kind of one of the reasons why. And it is the United States forces are controlled by General Douglas MacArthur. MacArthur was head of the U.S. Army occupation in Japan. He had been running Japan since the end of World War II. He had been the highest ranking commander in the Pacific. He had been the U.S. military governor in the Philippines during before World War II. He's the one who has to flee when it's conquered by the Japanese. So he's deeply familiar with East Asian culture. And he leads the U.S. forces. During the Civil War, right before the United States, before MacArthur gets involved, the communists push all the way down to here, right? Only this very southern part of South Korea is still controlled by the democratic South Koreans. And so then MacArthur lands his forces here in Incheon, a kind of surprise attack. He's able to push them all the way back. So you can see here, he's able to push them all the way back to the border with China. MacArthur desperately wants to invade China. He is not given permission by the president to do so, but they may or may not, there may have been maybe a few crossings. And the Chinese are enough threatened that they enter the war. They enter the war on the side of the North Koreans and also to protect their border because they're worried about what MacArthur is going to do. And the North Koreans, plus the help of the Chinese, are able to force it all the way back. As we are retreating, we are pursuing a scorched earth policy and dropping a lot of bombs. In fact, we're dropping more bombs than we are dropping during World War II. Eventually, the armistice is signed at the 38th parallel, but again, there is no peace treaty. During this war, 4 million Koreans and Chinese will be killed. Majority of them will be civilians, and 33,000 Americans will be killed. And this starts what's called the domino theory. Right, the idea that if one state in Asia falls to the communists, then all of them will fall to the communists, like falling dominoes. Right, so it ends at the 38th parallel. The next place we're going to talk about is Vietnam, and we're going to start with this guy. His name is Ho Chi Minh. And in 1945, Ho Chi Minh declares independence for Vietnam. Vietnam had been a colony of the French. Then, during World War II, they are occupied by the Japanese. The French flee. The French are incapable of protecting their colony of Vietnam. And the Japanese institute this kind of brutal reign of terror in Vietnam. So in 1945, when the Vietnamese are able to defeat the Japanese, and the Japanese are defeated by the Americans and the other allies, Ho Chi Minh, who was educated in France, declares himself their leader and he declares their independence. He issues what's called the Vietnamese Declaration of Independence. In it, he says, all men are created equal. They are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This immortal statement was made in the Declaration of Independence. In a broader sense, this means all peoples on the earth are equal from birth. All the peoples have a right to live, to be happy, and free. The Declaration of the French Revolution, made in 1791, on the rights of man and the citizen also states all men are born free and with equal rights, and must always remain free and have equal rights. Nevertheless, for more than 80 years, the French imperialists, abusing the standard of liberty, equality, and fraternity, right? This is the motto of the French Revolution, have violated our fatherland and oppressed our fellow citizens. They've acted contrary to the ideals of humanity and justice. In the field of politics, they've deprived our people of every democratic liberty. They have enforced inhuman laws, and they have set up 3 distinct political regimes in order to wreck our national unity. They have built more prisons than schools. They have fleeced us to the backbone, impoverished our people, and devastated our land. During World War II, our people were subjected to the double yoke of the French and the Japanese. Their sufferings and miseries increased. More than 2 million of our fellow citizens died from starvation. So this is an independence movement that is caught up in the Cold War. So, starting in 1945, the Vietnamese start fighting against the French. The United States decided to aid the French, which is strange for us because the Vietnamese are fighting for their independence from a European colonial power, which is something that's kind of dear to our hearts. But because of the threat of communism, right, think especially in 1949, China falls to communism. So in 1950, we decide to aid the French so that way Vietnam does not turn communist. By 1954, the French have been defeated. What is created is called the Geneva Accords. And the Geneva Accords set up 2 separate Vietnams, a North Vietnam and a South Vietnam. And they are supposed to unite after 2 years. So in 1956, there's supposed to be a vote in which people decide what they want to do. So in the north, it's led by Ho Chi Minh. He essentially starts implementing communism. In the south, we set up this guy. His name is Ngo Dinh Diem. He's not great, but he's not a communist. And in 1956, he actually cancels the election because he's worried he is going to lose. So we've already talked about kind of Dictator 101, you cancel elections, right? So um, that happens in 1956. So, starting then in 1960, Kennedy is elected president, but really we're just advising the Vietnamese by then. Both of them, Diem and Kennedy, are assassinated in 1963. Johnson becomes president, and he's the president we most associate with the Vietnam War. And in 1964, the USS Maddox is off the coast in the Gulf of Tonkin, and it is shot at, kind of. So the president asks for what's called the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which grants him broad powers to use the U.S. military in Vietnam, and that is how we get involved. So it's called the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, that we can use, quote, all measures to repel attack in Vietnam. Later it comes out that maybe or maybe not that the USS Maddox was attacked. But at the time, they really thought it was. Of course, right, the Vietnam War is about preventing the spread of communism. It is about the domino theory. And it really starts to escalate in 1968. At that point, there are more than 500,000 American troops. Is the height of the Vietnam War. There are 500,000 American troops in Vietnam. And it starts off with Vietnamese New Year with what's called the Tet Offensive. This happens in 1968. There are huge casualties. It's a surprise attack. It's just horrifying to the Americans. We are able to actually push them back and stop the Tet Offensive, but it just was so shocking. Because of the very nature of the Vietnam War, because it is a counterinsurgency, it's very difficult to tell friend from foe, like who is the enemy. And that, coupled with the jungle fighting, makes it very a very, very challenging war to fight, a very, very challenging war to win. And it's very, very trying on the soldiers, right? There's not a clear enemy. It's not like you're fighting the Nazis and they're evil, right? It's much more like you're fighting these people who don't want you here and you're not sure why you're here. And it's something about communism and why are you in the jungle and why are only poor kids getting drafted? Um, so that makes it kind of so complicated. And so we start dropping bombs. We drop more bombs than were dropped in World War II, like by all sides in Vietnam and Cambodia. After 1970, US opinion really starts to shift against the war. Um, the US population is unsettled by the bombing. Um, we are kind of just, we see it, right? It's the first televised war. So because it is in everyone's living rooms, they're like, oh, God, no. And at that point, right in 1973, President Nixon is able to kind of bring it down and sign the Paris Peace Accords, which start the ceasefire, in which Ho Chi Minh is able to begin to overrun the South because U.S. troops are abandoning Vietnam, kind of for lack of a better term. Something I want to talk about here are some of the effects of the Vietnam War. You can see the bombing, right? You can see that it crosses over into Cambodia. So that really kind of upsets things in Cambodia, and because of that, a communist revolution takes place in Cambodia, and this really awful, brutal dictator Pol Pot, who leads a group called the Khmer Rouge, sets up a brutal, murderous regime in Cambodia because of kind of what happens with the Vietnam War. So by 1975, North Vietnam is able to overrun South Vietnam, and they are able to make their way, right? So kind of the capital of North Vietnam is Hanoi. They've been able, here was the line, they're able to push their way all the way to Saigon and capture the capital of independent capitalist South Vietnam. And that happens in 1975. And this is the last helicopter. It's kind of a super famous photo. It's called the last helicopter out of Saigon. And so these are all of the Americans and any kind of elite Vietnamese who can escape are escaping. There are just hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese refugees. They've become what quote unquote boat people. They're going to the Philippines, they're going to Australia, they're going to New Zealand, they're going to the United States, right? We have a huge Vietnamese population in the United States because we do relax our immigration policies in order to accept all of these Vietnamese refugees because we feel very responsible for kind of abandoning them to a communist takeover. Like think about Little Viet Town at Mills and 50, right? A lot of those people are refugees from what happens